I think it would be very beneficial for you to contribute by asking questions or maybe comments for our speakers. Anybody?
I have a question that I suppose is directed both to Vincent and Emily. So I'm a bit of a outsider to this field, so my question might be a bit naive, but one thing that strikes me is that I guess I want to know more from you about in each of the cases that you were studying, how context played a part in the thinking of these artists and architects. So in the case of Vincent, you were talking about the monument of communism, one of its biggest offenses being that it didn't really take context into account. And since I don't know Hirshhorn's work very much, I thought maybe I was wondering how or if he takes context into account with his monuments. And then to Emily, a similar question. You know, you brought out these two aspects of Charney's practice, both his interest in vernacular, but then these megastructures which were sort of pre-made which from what I understand from your presentation, to be sort of, you know, to go into any context and to be, I suppose, adapted in some way. And so I was wondering if maybe you could reflect a little bit on what his feelings were, how context plays a part in the megastructure.
For sure. Well, I think that's kind of. Do I need a mic? Yeah. Sure. Okay. Give me the mic. I think that's what I was trying to highlight is kind of the unique combination that Charney was making between vernacular and megastructures. That you don't really think of them as of them as being somewhat opposite, but I think that what he was really concerned was with this. He was very anti-monument, and so for him, this idea of being able to empower people to either make their own homes through vernacular architecture, or if they have to use technology, then to give them these very flexible spaces that they could then create themselves within this highly technologized network. So in terms of context, I mean, I guess for me, like I think that his context within the Quiet Revolution and those politics is very interesting, and so I think that he did kind of bring the megastructure into a very specific context. But megastructures were kind of criticized for being these kind of universalizing, overly utopian spaces where individuality was supposed to be being generated, but was inevitably kind of lost. Does that make sense?
It does. It
Okay.
clarifies it in my mind.
Okay. I'm glad you brought the question of context up, because it's my answer will be very concise, because I still don't understand Hirshhorn's position about context. He has always claimed that that context is not at all relevant to the work that he makes. He's always said, I don't care about where my monuments are located. I'm trying to achieve something universal. But obviously that is very questionable, because he has always chosen poor neighborhood, not even in the case of the Bataille monument, which was in Casa for the Document 11. Even in that case, his four monuments were located in poor neighborhoods. The Bronx for the Gramsci monument, and then I forget the name of the neighborhood in Casa, but it was the same case for the Spinoza and the Taien monument. And I think that Hirshhorn is very concerned with context, and that he has chosen these locations because he has, because of his social objective, and he is very concerned to give back to the community to a certain extent. But still, he refuses to acknowledge that context is a definite factor. And his work. So it's very contradictory, and it's the best that I can offer as an answer.
Thank you.
Beatrice?
It's a question for Vincent. It's kind of following in, it's kind of an extension of what you were talking about. Do you, I guess it's more, I'm more curious about what you think about it, but how do you see him, or how do you see Hirschhorn reconciling this, the placement of these monuments in poor neighborhoods and the juxtaposition of that with the kind of disheveled aesthetics and the fact that he says he's giving back to the community? How do you reconcile these three things, which to me sound, well, that I found very kind of problematic?
It's an interesting question, particularly with regards to the materials that or his aesthetic. And it's a very complex issue. I mean, you could argue that this kind of aesthetic is just Hirschhorn's general aesthetic. I mean, he uses it in his work in public space, but he also uses it in his work in gallery spaces. So it's not, so it doesn't necessarily have, I mean, you could argue, I guess, that it doesn't necessarily have, that it's kind of irrelevant to like the context, to like, what I'm trying to say is that it's not a conscious decision that he makes when he works in public space that he's going to have this kind of poor aesthetic in poor neighborhoods. It's just the aesthetic that he uses all the time. So I don't really know. I haven't thought.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, but it's a really good question. One thing that does come back though in his writing is when he talks about this aesthetic is, and I guess, I mean, that could answer your question, is the idea that, so Hirschhorn is very concerned to give back to communities. And he wants his work to be as transparent as possible. And so he always uses very common materials like plastic, wood, and materials that are like so much a part of our everyday life that it doesn't. They're not like rich materials that when you're going to see them, you're going to be like, okay, this is art, and it's going to create a kind of distance between the spectator and the work. I think using these materials allows him to create this sort of transparency with the general public, not just the poor neighborhood, but with the general public. And does that begin to answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I'm trying to understand the uses of the idea of populism or universalism. I once asked Mr. Charney at a public meeting at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, what, if any, connection existed between the sculptures he designed for the park outside Barrie de Montney metro station and the public in the area, since everybody makes a big fuss about populism, about connection with the public and so forth. And his reply was interesting. He said, I don't do art for the public. They're too ignorant to understand much of what's going on anyway. In addition to which, he said, they use these sculptures to dry their wet socks. So there's a use for them. So how does one define populism or universalism when we have situations like that? I'm just trying to understand how one can sort of make these connections.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of Charney's career, when he was building public art in Montreal, that was much later on in his career. And so he kind of went through these series of shifts where he was always interested in vernacular architecture, but he went through this particular period being
By the way,
interested
could
in
you speak a little
technology.
louder, possibly? I might have a
Sorry.
little trouble hearing, sorry.
Okay.
Hold it closer.
Closer to my mouth, is this?
Tap it.
It is on. It is on, but it's not
Oh.
really.
It's not working?
Do something there.
I can speak louder. So.
Now it's
Yell
on.
at you guys. Charney went through like some shifts over the periods of his career. So he had this period of being interested in technology, and then he kind of fiercely rejected that and was very interested in these political initiatives. So we did this exhibition of coffee d'art, and he was looking at, he did an exhibition called Montreal Plus or Minus, where he was kind of looking at the dematerialization of architecture. And that was kind of happening in the 70s. And then in the 80s, he was looking more at architecture as an image. And so he kind of went through this process of totally dematerializing architecture to then just kind of like a two-dimensional representation. And so from what I understand, I haven't studied his public artworks as much as I've studied his earlier works, but his public artworks are much more about a representation of like an abstracted form of architecture, and he's not really drawing at all on this kind of earlier interest in populism. So I think, I mean, I can't say exactly what was going on in Charney's head, but I know that from his work or what's been written about his work that there was like a very distinct shift. So from what you've said, it sounds like Charney wasn't interested in populism at all by the end of his career, so I can't really say that there was any relation between them.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone. Those were really wonderful papers, beautifully put together as well. I have a question for Taien. Taien, I love the introduction, at least for me, to these different kinds of critical cartography. They're really interesting and challenging forms of cartography. But my question actually has to do with something you said right at the beginning of your paper, where you were talking about this shift from the traditional paper map to digital, more ubiquitous forms of digital maps. I'm not sure I quite agree that they are as widely used as maybe you suggest that they are. I mean, that kind of presumes that everyone has a handheld device. I'm not sure that everyone does. But what I wanted to ask you about it was, you said that the spatial tactics have disappeared from paper maps in this transition to digital maps. And I'm so curious as to what you mean, because I mean, if I think about Dussertaux's distinction between the tactic and the strategy is something that's part of a hegemonic reality.
Yeah.
Something that is, like the monuments, there's something where you can observe, hegemony in action, I suppose, static action. But tactics are something far less easily representable. And so I'm not sure where or in what maps, paper or digital, you're imagining that tactics would have been represented. So can you sort of unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I actually don't mean that those spatial practices have disappeared from the move from paper to digital, but rather from the construction of the map itself as a representation of science, right? So like back in your presentation, where it's very obviously a colonial argument, there's flourishes and the beaver and all that has sort of disappeared from what we see now as a scientific representation of space, right? But which is also an argument for how we see space, right? As rather than a narrative space, it's representational, right? And in that, the narrative practices have disappeared, right? So back in the colonial map, you still see vestiges of those narratives, right? And then when you're talking about tactics versus strategies, I think that the tactics, I'm talking about trying to relate them back into the map through the mapping of ephemeralities. And so that's where I try to address how do you do that? And I mean, part of the larger discussion is representation, right? And maps as representation, and trying to move away from that, of course, which is very difficult because we're so inured in representation, and then to move to maps as a process or a practice, which is no longer representational, but which maybe can no longer be called a map. They're now mapping practices, but they don't tell you how to get to places, but they do represent those small tactics that we do. And we're just still, I think we're still trying to address those issues, but mostly through art now. But how do we affect the larger change of changing our spatial imagination? And I mean, Google Maps is obviously, like, through Google Street View, I think it kind of helps in that, but at the same time it reinforces the binary opposition of, you know, the overhead view and the human view. So how can we merge those things, which I think is what one of the main things that I'm trying to get at.
I have a couple questions. The first for Amanda. So it's a very beginner's question. But what kinds of functions did the cartouche sort of perform in these early modern maps? You know, you've shown maps which had several. So could you explain a little bit what some of the other functions of the cartouche?
Yeah, well, the cartouche sort of, you know, sets the stage for how you're gonna read the map. I mean, there's the actual, you know, the land that's represented in the map, which is sort of, you know, claiming or demarcating an empire's territories. But then you have the cartouche, which sort of function as like little paintings in the map. So they're sort of setting or giving a narrative to the map. So, for example, the beaver maps are dedicated to the king's son, the Dauphin, and so you sort of get the sense that the Nicola de Favre or whatever is wanting the king and his son and his family to see sort of the resources that are available in the New World, or sort of work that's going on in establishing the colonies and construction projects and this and that. So I think, you know, on a very basic level, the cartouche really just provides a narrative to accompany the more, you know, quote unquote scientific elements of the map.
Great. And my second question for Taien, have some practitioners come up with alternative names to map? We've seen sometimes adjectives added to maps, but have some, you know, people come up with entirely different names for maps, or do they still sort of?
No, they still call them maps, but the word map has become such a metaphor in so much of cultural discourse in general. In the presentation right before this, they were talking about mapping out caterpillars' routes, and those are also, like, you know, the word map just seems to denote any spatial practice now, right? Whether it is a representation or not. So instead of coming up with new words for maps, it just seems like the meaning has exploded into so many ways that I mean, it's almost become a little bit meaningless. So that's why people say mapping practice to denote the other maps as process, but they still say maps.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, maybe a new word is needed, I don't know. But
no, I don't know. Because I was thinking in my mind, at which point does it stop being a map?
Yeah, exactly.
Because in the art world, it seems like there's much more of a desire to, you know, for example, with painting, you know, to go beyond painting and use other words to describe new pictorial practices, which might still incorporate what used to be in paintings, you know, but they use new words like assemblage or other
no,
things.
now it's been like I come from cinema as well, and now they're using the map to refer to films, right? Like cartographic cinema, right? And the practices of cinema is very, very similar to the mapping impulse. And we talked about this in our workshop, and how, you know, mapping has become just a synonym for a spatial practice, and it connects all of our papers actually, these spatial practices, and it's the same kinds of criticisms sort of come up in all of our work. It's dealing with, for example, the binary oppositions of, for example, populism and universalism. What do those mean? Like, the universal, what does that mean? Obviously, you know, people think, oh, it means a certain thing, but it's code for perhaps modernism. Right? Yeah. So that's a way of mapping as well. Everything is a way of mapping. It's
Yes.
I think it's really interesting, this discussion about the fluidity of the term map and how it's being appropriated and reimagined. But I'd just like to throw you guys, like, from 500 years ago, an example of this. The world maps, or mappa mundi, were found in cloisters, churches, and these were maps, but only in name because they really were not supposed to even be geographically accurate.
No, they're not directing you to any, and they're not directing you to a place.
No.
They're more world views. They're maps of
Yeah,
world views.
exactly.
And in the transition from the old maps like that to the modern map, the view of the map has been lost as a world view, but it really still is, right? So the map as a scientific object is still a world view, but because it's become hegemonic, you know, whenever anything is hegemonic, it kind of disappears because it's so pervasive, right? So it's been a long journey to that, but I think it's still the case. That
Yeah, it's been a consistent.
It's a worldview. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. As a stand-in for our worldviews in any given era. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just thought I'd put that up there.
Yeah, we have plenty of time.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Eleanor, for bringing that up, because I think that's what I had on my mind as well, and I was just trying to sort of negotiate between like Amanda's and also Emily, your mentions and the use of mapping, and also Taien, also what that implicates to use the term mapping, in fact, as a verb. And I'm just thinking of Deleuze saying, don't make a map, like do a trace, right?
No, the other way around.
The other way around.
Yeah.
Okay, so something like, so I'm just, but that's the whole distinction, right? To how do you sort of distance the colonial history or the colonial practice of mapping as inherently a colonial practice of empire. And I was just triggered by that because Amanda, in your one of your methodologies is to reach out to decolonizing methodologies, and so it just for me it seemed to jar a little bit. So I was just wondering about that. Maybe perhaps you're already working through that as well. And also, Emily, for when you mention empire, right? And again, I'm thinking, okay, what kind of politics are you mapping out to be precise? Because there is a colonial baggage to the discourse around the empire of that literature that you're referring to in relation to Quebec, right? Yeah. So, it's thoughts.
I'm not sure. There's not really a question, but in terms of like my own research, yeah, there's very much trying to expand on those colonial legacies that the map sort of stands for. You know, the maps that I'm looking at in the early modern period, inevitably you look at them and you see that colonial legacy, and it's sort of it's just, you know, that's almost all it is, or all it has ever stood for. So I think through my research, I'm trying to, you know, bring in alternative sources of information. Often in critical cartography, we're going to talk about ethnocartographic practices and counter mapping, and bringing in, you know, native forms of map making, and how do you bring that back into the narrative. In the case of my own research, it wasn't necessarily useful to look at native map making, but native oral histories has been more useful. So that's sort of just in response to like.
Which has also been called mapping, right? Like,
yes.
You know, like song lines, for example, is another, you know, view. The application of the word map to so many things can kind of counter the very specific colonial map if you're using it in so many ways that is in one way trying to decouple the historic context of it.
Taien, you seem to be probably a lot more advanced in terms of new maps than I am. Do you find a common discourse that runs through most of these new forms of map making that would tie into what Mr. Wood said regarding, doesn't the map merely reproduce? If it doesn't, then everything would be open to debate, in the sense that if we do not follow this certain predetermined physicality of the map and how's it ingrained in our brain, then everything's open up debate, I guess. And how do you find any authors of maps dealing with that, this post-map making? I guess?
That's exactly where in critical cartography it's going toward post-representation. And so it's at this point it's really highly theoretical. So we have Nigel Thrift talking about post-representation theory in general, which tends to focus more on the senses rather than vision as a main point of mapping. Deleuze and Guattari, of course, who, as Alice was talking about, talk in terms about a re-territorialization of the map as flights away from, the map itself as the new kind of mapping. But in practice, like as a cartographer, what does that translate to, right? It's like we're moving away from representation, but we're still, how can you tell someone how to get somewhere in those terms? So we're really talking about something almost completely different in the way that maps, are made, which is why it's hard to visualize what it can be, right? So I can understand it theoretically, yes, okay, you want something that's open, that's always reforming itself, that can be, contextual in every way, that takes into account how you also constitute place, in space, and all these things. But when it comes right down to it, as a cartographer, like I'm not really sure how that would look like. I can't even say, like, we're trying to get away from the vision. So what would that be? Can it be sound? I mean, I'm also a filmmaker, right? So I'm trying to like experiment with map making in terms of cinema, for instance, like film maps, because we're talking about time and cartography. How can you get the time back into the map? Well, maybe through cinema, but it doesn't live up to what, for example, Deleuze and Guattari want, right? Like, make a map, not a tracing. Well, what exactly can that difference be? So I think right now it's still very theoretical and not concrete. But I guess that's the point, right? It shouldn't be concrete. New map making.
I really enjoyed everyone's papers, thank you, but my question is for Emily. The theme, unless Google is failing me, the theme for Osaka 70 was progress and harmony for mankind.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you could address how Chinese, whether you've thought through like the idea of progress and harmony and this kind of supposition that one leads to the other, and how Chinese proposition either challenges that more broadly or maybe points to it, and points specifically in the Canadian context to this disharmony with the Quiet Revolution.
That's interesting. Well, I mean, progress and harmony for mankind. I mean, the world fairs during this like very modern period they were always kind of advocating this really extreme kind of utopian ideas of how we could progress humanity through science, and that was an ongoing theme. And kind of and Expo 70 is often kind of considered the end of that era of world fairs. But there was a lot of like techno-utopian architecture at Expo 70. There was the Festival Plaza, which was built by Arata Izozaki, used cybernetics to create like an interactive space. And so a lot of what Charney was doing was kind of drawing on what the Japanese metabolists were doing in Japan. In terms of him kind of challenging the ideas of progress and harmony, yeah, I mean, I think that there's like, I think he's kind of like including, or kind of, he's trying to find this balance between like a vernacular space and these technological spaces, right? And so when you are trying to progress into the future or engage these new technologies, you're always kind of walking this line. You're trying to find this middle ground where you're advancing, but you're not losing everything that you've already got. You know what I mean? And so I think that is kind of what he was kind of challenging, is trying to find harmony within that preference. If that makes sense. I don't know.
Just a quick point that connects Vincent and Emily. One thing, looking at the Charney floor plans, is the first thing the visitors would have encountered is a coffee house or
Yeah.
cafe, you know. And that's very much in the spirit of Expo 67, where food plays such a big role. And I was wondering, and related, so the architect in a way becomes a kind of facilitator also of like these encounters between people sort of eating, feeling together, not just looking at art as they might have in the more traditional exhibition setting. But I was wondering in relation to the Hirshhorn museum, not museum, but monument that I haven't been to, only heard sort of secondhand accounts of, but did people sort of interact in this context of sort of sharing food or, you know, getting together? So what were some of the activities that went on? We saw a few photos, but
Yeah.
could you elaborate
Yeah.
on that a little bit?
Well, there's one thing I'd like to say. First, you mentioned like the floor plans, and yeah, I'd like to mention that the Gramsci monument in particular had this again, the theme of this conference, this networks. It was really like a network-like plan. There wasn't a single entrance to the monument, and so people could enter whatever places, like segments of the monuments they wanted. And but with regards to your question specifically, well, there were many activities that involved the local population. One of them was, I mentioned there was sort of like a small radio station, and so people were, a lot of kids were involved in that. There was also like a publication where that was, that originated in sort of like public, like group readings of texts by Gramsci, and then they would move on to like create a like weekly publication about texts that they particularly liked, or responses to these texts, or things like what is happening this week in the neighborhood, stuff like that, to really involve the local inhabitants. What else? Hirshhorn, for some reason, well, I mean, as he was researching on philosophers, he made a lot of contacts in the philosophy world, and so invited many philosophers to discuss the ideas of Gramsci, and so there were a lot of public lectures, and people were encouraged to participate in those and ask questions, and so activities of that sort.
It seems.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, Vincent. It seems that Hirshhorn, I'm not too familiar with his work, except on a few occasions his name came up, but his work is based in a sort of social flux, where like by the installment, the functioning of it, and the de-installment of it, that is supposed to create a social stimulus, I guess.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the point of his work, so interaction in society.
Yeah.
And now, apart from this constant fluctuation in buildings, what is he really planning at a long-term period to get these buildings or future buildings to actually keep on sustaining social stimulus, I guess?
That's an excellent question. Like the Hirshhorn hasn't really planned any long-term public art projects. All of his work in public art and in the public sphere have been temporary up until now. But he is very engaged in the artistic circles around the world, and he meets people to talk about his work, and he encourages people to talk about his work, and he's very provoking. And I think I mentioned it earlier during my talk. What I'm doing right now is sort of perpetuating this monument, and that's sort of his. There's the physical monument, which is temporary, but we could argue that the long-term dimension of the monument is this sort of like history, like verbal.
Discourse around it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The discourse around it and the writing. That's sort of what will persist.
And it seems like it's not meant to be long-term because it's an event-based
Yeah,
thing, right?
yeah.
So if it's there all the time, it's no longer an event.
Yeah.
That's how I guess I kind of see it that way.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, you might say that is it really effective to do something temporary like that? Can it really achieve long-term goals if you are going to dismantle the monument after 2 months?
Sure, why not?
Yeah.
I mean, most things that, like all the situationists' work is very ephemeral.
Yeah.
Ephemeral, but they're still affecting everything. Not everything, but they're very, central in a lot of discourse, right?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I tend to think like that too.
Yeah.
If we're trying to play the devil's advocate here. Some people have criticized precisely the temporariness, the ephemerality of the public artworks of Hirshhorn, precisely because, well, they say, what's the point of doing something temporary in the Bronx? It's going to, create, like foster relationships in the community for summer, and then it's going to be, it's going to be over. So, like, what's the point of that? But then people have like tried to
Relational
refute
art
that.
is all about that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's very valid, I think. Yeah.
And people have tried to refute that argument and have interviewed people in these neighborhoods post, monument, and have asked them, have you seen, differences do you see a difference in the community after the passage of Hirshhorn? And so there's a really, empirical, groundwork, kind of research being done to sort of try to prove the long-term efficacy of Hirshhorn's work. Yeah.
I think that's the instrumental language of capitalism, which is always based on success and failure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, for you, what's more important than reiterating that language and appearing in some ways to espouse it would be to look at a whole other trajectory of critical thinking about utopia. And actually there was a really great example last night with Mackenzie Wark's talk where he was saying, in fact, the utopia is profound and practical.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other people like Rosalind Deutsch who's looking at things like publicness and democracy as that which is never guaranteed. You can't come up with a formula for success. All you can do is rehearse it relentlessly over and over again using any means at your disposal, which I think is what he does.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that would be my suggestion to you, that rather than labor on someone's criticism, but to use instead the kind of dynamic theoretical models that have been out there for 20 years and longer, to actually show the rather impoverished nature of the critique.
Mm-hmm.
We always have good ways to, suggestions would make a good segue to our next coffee break. And we have one last group of presenters, so I hope you stick around. And thanks again so much to all 4 of our presenters.